Okay. I don't know where to look anymore. Good morning, everyone. This is the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting study. And this is our final meeting on Friday, December 10th. Thank you for joining us. We have put out our preliminary draft report. It is on our website for anybody who hasn't yet found it. And it has been emailed to all of the stakeholders, and many of them will be testifying today to tell us their thoughts on our final report. So we're going to get started. And just for everybody who is testifying today, all the witnesses, we will be keeping pretty strict time because we have a number of witnesses that we really want to and actually need to hear from. And this is our last meeting. So we're giving each of you 15 minutes, and Representative Kornheiser and I will be tracking the time. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. And if you do go over, we're gonna have to cut you off and just ask you to stop out of respect for the next witnesses to make sure we get everybody in. So I just wanted to let you know ahead of time. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to stay on task and on our agenda. And we would hope and would eagerly await any written testimony that you have, and to post it on our website for public, but also for the task force members to read, so that we have your full testimony if you are not able to say everything you want to say in the 15 minutes.
And actually, if I can add, and we don't usually take minutes of the meetings, but both Catherine and Sorsha are taking notes from the public comment today, so that when we're moving into revisions, we have a solid record of any conversations that happened today.
Yes, and then this afternoon, we're going to go over the report with our JFO staff for the full task force in a sort of orderly manner. So as you're looking at it, task force members, if there are things that you want to make sure we discuss this afternoon, please note them. So we're going to start with Professor Tammy Colby, who is the primary author of the original report on the pupil weighting. And so take it away, Professor Colby. Thank you for being with us. If you could just identify yourself and do the thing, you know.
Good morning, everyone. For the record, Tammy Colby. I'm an associate professor of educational policy at the University of Vermont, and also, as Senator Hardy noted, one of the authors of the original weighting study report that was commissioned by the legislature and the agency. I, like everybody else, had a short period of time to review the report, and so I want to keep my comments focused on some big high-level considerations as you move forward. And like per your request, Ruth, I'll try to get some written comments to you as well in a timely way. It is the last week of classes. Things are a little crazy in my world, as it is everyone else. I do have some slides real quick to share, and I'll share my screen. It says disabled. So I'll just, I assume the task force has the slides in front of them, and for time, I'll just.
Yeah.
Okay. General public won't, but they can access those on your website, correct?
Exactly.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Great. So just again, quickly, I want to start by acknowledging all the hard work that's gone into this by the task force, JFO and AOE and everyone. You know, school funding reform is hard. It's hard for a lot of reasons. And, there's a lot of hard work that's been done. And I would just want to thank everyone for doing that. What I read in the report is a level of knowledge and an understanding of school funding in Vermont that I haven't seen before. And I think that is certainly a really great outcome of this entire process. So thank you for everyone for engaging in such a thoughtful way. What I read in the report and reflected upon is, really what I see there is sort of this thread where, we're dealing with this tension between two policy goals, which is one, we want to equalize educational opportunity for students in Vermont. That is making sure that all students have equal educational opportunities, regardless of where they live or what it is that their community's resources look like. And at the same time, we want to make sure generating revenues in a fair and efficient way. That is taxpayer equity. And so we're trying to optimize on these two things in our policy, right? We're trying to optimize on equity for students, and we're trying to optimize on equity for taxpayers. And optimizing on one of those is hard. Optimizing on both of those is even harder. And I think it's important that we recognize right off the bat that that's the challenge that we're trying to get at here, not just in the task force report, but also in existing legislation. So with that in mind, right, there are these two policy proposals that are embedded in the report. The first one would update the weights in the current equalized pupil calculation based on some of the findings that came from our study. And the other one would move us in a little bit different direction, where we would adopt a new categorical funding approach for equalizing costs. And I want to offer just some high-level comments and reflections on those two options as the task force continues with its work over the next few days. With respect to option one, updating weights, I think it's important that I just clarify, not for the task force and everyone else, that what is currently included in the report in terms of the weights, there's been some confusion around whether or not those weights were empirically derived. The weights that are presented in the report, which look like new weights, were empirically derived from the same models presented in the initial weighting study from the school models. And we, as the authors of the report, provided those to JFO and the task force. Why are the magnitudes of the weights different? And I think it's really important to stress this, is that because we changed some assumptions at the task force request. And those are assumptions that as authors of the report, we don't object to. And that is changing the measure of student economic disadvantage and moving to additive weights in the equation. So I think that's just an important clarification to the level set on that. The other thing I just want to note and be clear about is that the recommendations do modify one of our report recommendations by using the categorical grant to adjust for costs for educating ELL students rather than weights. That is certainly a policy option. It comes with its strengths and weaknesses, and we address sort of our reflections on that in our October 28th memo. What I want to spend the most of my time on today, though, is option two. And if you're following along on the slides, I'm on slide 5. And that is this proposal for categorical funding, right? So we have our first option sort of updates what we have. This moves us in a new direction. And essentially what the categorical funding option is what we would in school funding think of as a reverse foundation formula, where we provide foundation grants for specified categories of students and schools intended to offset cost differences. And I think it's really important that we recognize that that's in fact what we're doing here. These are not tertiary or supplemental grants. These are cost adjustments that are coming in the form of a reverse foundation. Why is it a reverse foundation? It's a reverse foundation because we actually don't have a foundation or a consistent amount to which we are applying those dollars. And that's something I'm going to come back to in a moment. And I think it's important to note that similar approaches have been used in other states, most recently in New York State. And based on those experiences, there are some lessons to be learned. And so one thing I noted in the report is that, and this is always the case, when you have an existing policy like the equalized pupil calculation, the known limitations are easier to identify, right, and talk about. And I think the report does that pretty fairly. Sometimes I think a little more strongly than I might agree with, but I think, overall, it's a fair assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of what we see currently. What I saw in the report, and this oftentimes happens with a new idea, is there's more language to talk about the strengths of the categorical or this reverse foundation formula than there are the potential limitations or trade-offs with that. And so I just want to highlight some of those, not so much to be sort of the voice of loyal opposition, but again, in thinking about sort of the kinds of things you might include in a revised edition of your report that provides sort of a more balanced assessment of the two. So I think and I'm on slide 6, I think there are 5 trade-offs or limitations that are worth considering in the policy discussions going forward of the reverse foundation formula option. 1, they're challenging to appropriately calibrate and maintain. 2, there are equity concerns. 3, cost containment. 4, the potential for political manipulation, and 5, this issue of competition of resources. And again, none of these necessarily are fatal flaws. And so I want to be clear about that. But again, in the conversation that I think will go forward, where policymakers are going to be weighing option 1 and option 2, I think it's important to have sort of an understanding of what some of these limitations may be. And so I want to talk through those quickly. I do have my time going, so I'm checking to make sure I'm staying on time, Senator Hardy. Oh, and
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. It stopped on me. So with respect to calibration and maintenance, right? And this is referenced in the report, but I think it's important just to highlight once again, is that it's challenging to appropriately calibrate and maintain categorical grant systems this way, right? It's difficult to get the grant amount right. What should the grant be? And we've already seen some of that discussion around ELLs. It's very difficult to do. You can do it. And we, as the report notes, are finalizing some estimates based on our models that we will be sharing in the near term. But it's not an easy, straightforward thing to do. Even if you use other approaches, such as the evidence-based approach that Larry Pike has used, it doesn't matter what the approach, it's still difficult to do. Second, in Vermont, I think we have to remember is that we're taking these categorical grants and we're applying them to uneven bases, right? That's the reverse foundation, right? Which means that the grants on a proportional basis will mean something very different in different districts and schools. And so we have to think about that too, the proportionality to the base. 3, they will need to be updated frequently, right? To make sure, and update by update, I mean, not just index for inflation. We're going to need to really carefully consider whether or not the grants are calibrated for current needs and cost differentials. And 5, it does add a new set of legislative and administrative burdens for appropriating and allocating funds. It will require more work. It will require work on the part of the legislature and AOE and JFO to do all of these things each year. And so those are just some trade-offs with this approach with regard to calibration and maintenance. Also, equity concerns. There are certainly equity concerns with the equalized pupil calculation too, but this approach is not, isn't sort of not have any kind of equity concerns. And I think the one that we need to just keep our eye on is the fact that categorical grants like this may in fact widen the gap between top and bottom spenders in the state. Why might that be? It might be the case because the dollar-based adjustments are most effective at the middle. If you think about it, this is an average grant amount, right? And so average grants favor districts and schools with lower than average costs and disadvantage those with higher than average costs, right? And if you think about the distribution. The other thing is that this may run counter to local control and decision-making. What do I mean by that? They don't really necessarily adjust for spending. What they do is they bring additional dollars into the system, but they're not adjusting local spending decisions in the same way that weights are right now. And so what could happen then, right, is that we end up with some districts as budget maximizers who may get more dollars than they necessarily would have received under the equalized pupil calculation, spending up to that categorical grant amount in their district budgets. It's a perfectly reasonable and rational economic response to a categorical grant program. And we have some evidence that districts do that in Vermont based on the reimbursement model for special education. So, there is the potential that this could widen the difference in spending between the top and the bottom spenders in the state. And that would introduce new kinds of, they could perpetuate existing differences as well as introduce new concerns. Moving on to page 9. Cost containment. And of all of them, this is certainly one that I didn't see much conversation about in the report, and I think it might warrant some additional reflection on the part of sort of the report's authors. Categorical grant program, like the one that's being proposed, will likely increase average per pupil spending statewide. Why might that be? Because some of these grants will likely over-adjust costs for some districts, creating incentives to either spend more than needed or provide or they might provide insufficient disincentives to constrain spending. For example, in the current formula, weights are intended to help constrain inappropriate spending, and it's unclear how the grant program will connect with sort of the current excess spending threshold. So again, districts will likely budget maximize and increase average per pupil spending into the and certainly on the bottom end, we hope that that will, right, that average spending will come up, but this might also occur at the middle and the top. And in doing so, without a governor on the top or even at the middle, the likely outcome is we're going to increase overall average spending in the state. And under our revenue generating scheme, that has implications for taxpayers across the state. 10, on slide 10, there's also the risk of that categorical grants are more easily susceptible for political manipulation. I'd like to think that everyone is altruistic in this sense, and this would never happen, but we know that it does. Appropriation, what a categorical, a reduced foundation funding formula like this that is comprised of categorical grants introduces the ability to tinker with appropriation levels. It opens up appropriations for cost differentials to legislative discretion in a way that they are not open right now. And if we need evidence that that could happen, I think we can look at the recent history with small school grants. Finally, and again, all the things I've talked about so far, I would consider sort of trade-offs. I do have one concern, and I use that, I'm being careful in using that term that way because it is a concern. And that concern was really prompted by something that I read on page 14 and 15 in the report. And I'm going to read it because I recognize that not everyone has the slides in front of them. And what this comment suggests to me is that there is a likelihood for competition for resources, and that would be really, really problematic. The quote goes as follows. Further, since cost equity payments would be distributed first, before determining base funding, it would be important to ensure that the payments, and this is my emphasis, do not draw so much funding towards specific costs in need, then insufficient base funding per pupil would be available statewide. In other words, what percentage of overall spending on K-12 education, and again, my emphasis, should go toward these areas of identified need compared to general spending per pupil? Why are those two statements problematic and concerning? They're concerning because it seems to suggest that the current construction and how these categorical grants are being thought of in this reverse foundation funding formula may operate is that these grants are being viewed as something tertiary or supplemental to general education funding. That is not the case. What we're talking about here are cost adjustments to general spending. These aren't grants for supplemental programs like arts education or a mental health supplement or trauma informed. These are cost adjustments to general education spending, right? And so even to conceptualize that there would be this competition for resources in the ed fund where these cost adjustments to general education spending might be considered, tinkered with, right? That there would be trade-offs made, undermines the entire intent of why we do cost adjustments to general education spending. The factors that are included in the categorical grants are cost factors that are outside of district control. We are adjusting for those cost factors to equalize, right? Tax capacity, to equalize spending ability across the state. So this idea that there might be this competition for resources or that they might be scrutinized in that way, for me, is quite concerning. And so I've just flagged that language as a concern that I think warrants more discussion as you go forward. Again, I know that option 2 is under development, and I welcomed and appreciated the language in the report that said this needs to be flushed out more. And so I offer sort of my more general, these bigger sort of policy framework markers as considerations going forward, as that debate sort of discussion and debate goes forward. But I will say that phrasing right there really raises concerns for me and seems to be very much counter to the intent of what cost adjustments, either made through the equalized people calculation or reverse foundation formula, their intended purpose. So let me just stop there. How to do, Senator Hardy? Did I stay within my time?
You did exactly on time, Professor Colby. Thank you very much for your testimony and for being with us here today. We appreciate all the time you've put into this work and all of the expertise that you've brought to this. So thank you so much, not just for today, but for everything you've done for this conversation and for the report and the work you've done. Thank you very much. Representative Kornheiser.
Thanks. I also just want to appreciate the continued collaboration on this, and that I have a deep gratitude that you were not able to get us the updated numbers for the cost equity proposal this week, because it would have just confused everything. And I'm very excited to see those numbers in the coming weeks as we prepare for the upcoming session. So
you should have them next week.
So thank you for the continued work on that, on updating those numbers for us as we evolve our thinking on this.
I know you're on a time schedule, but I'm certainly available to answer questions if anybody has any.
I am mixed on whether we should ask questions. You think we should? Okay. I just want to make sure that everybody gets the time. So if you have questions, we can take a couple questions. And Professor Colby, are you able to stay, or how long do you have with us this morning?
I can stay until 10:30, and then
Okay.
I need to do something else.
Understood. So if there are a couple questions, let's Representative James.
Thanks. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Colby. I do have a quick question. You had mentioned that it would be a challenge to appropriately maintain and calibrate the cost equity proposal. And my question is, since both the cost equity proposal and the weights are based on cost factors that would be, I assume, constantly changing over the years, why would it be harder to maintain the cost equity approach than it would be to maintain the weights?
Good question. I wasn't implying that it was harder. I was just implying I wasn't implying that it was harder. What I was noting is that in the report I didn't see. And again, when we have something new, it's we think through all the good stuff first, and then we sort of have to think through sort of what the trade-offs were. I was just noting that is a similar trade-off, right? That we would need to do that. That this should not be sort of a one and done kind of thing. Right. And I know the report mentions that, but again, in the spirit of trying to think systematically through what some of the considerations might be in terms of trade-offs, I just wanted to highlight that.
Thanks.
The only difference that would be, right, though, is that with right, I said sort of you will need to calibrate those, but there are different requirements each year. Here, with regard to AOE's responsibilities, I would expect JFO's responsibilities and legislature's responsibilities to appropriate these, which would mean new, right? Because the weights automatically calibrate, right? As opposed to there will need to be some distinct actions that happen. And, those are probably largely manageable. But, again, in the spirit of just saying like what's different and trying to weigh different trade-offs, I think that's just worth noting.
Are there other questions at the moment? Clarifications?
I guess I would just offer the clarification on behalf of Brad that the weights don't automatically calibrate every year. He spends a decent amount of time inside a spreadsheet counting them all every year.
Thank you. What I meant by automatically calibrate, it wouldn't be the case that Brad doesn't figure out that the secondary weight is point XYZ every year. Right. Yes. There are administrative costs that Brad bears every year. I've seen Brad's spreadsheets firsthand. They're excellent spreadsheets, very color coded. There are transaction costs with administering the weights too. And as he said, in reading the report, I just was trying to think about, okay, so here's this new and shiny thing. Let's just systematically think through here. What are some of the trade-offs with that approach as well? Not implying that they are more significant necessarily than what we have right now there. And that's why I'm using the word trade-offs, that they're trade-offs. The one concern I have is with respect to the language around competition for resources. And I'll just be honest, that's a pretty significant, that language for me is a pretty significant concern.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for Professor Colby? Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Colby. And I would welcome more conversation with you as we finalize the report over the next 5 days, if possible, and obviously going forward in the next session as well, and years to come, I'm sure. But thank you again for all of your work and your expertise. It's been amazing. So we really appreciate it.
Well, thanks to you and the task force for taking this on. And I was sincere with saying in saying that this is hard, right? And, there's a reason that this is some of the hardest policymaking that gets done in state government. And, I just want to acknowledge all the work that you all have done. And, the report reflects a really deep and nuanced understanding of what is one of the most complicated funding systems in the country. So good job.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
I can stay on muted until 10:30 in case something comes up.
Great. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Karen, I see you on the screen. We have a witness here in person that is on a time constraint. Do you mind if he goes first? Do you have time to hang out for a little bit longer?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. So next witness is Alex Yin. Yeah, go ahead and take the seat and just introduce yourself, your name and where you're from, and then proceed. And I will do a rough estimate of keeping time so that we can stay on schedule. Thanks, Mr. Yin.
Thank you. And thank you, Karen, for giving me this opportunity to speak ahead of time. My name is Alex Sheehan, and thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the Coalition for Vermont Student Equity. I want to first thank the task force for your report on pupil weighting. I greatly appreciate the time and effort it took to complete the report over the past 6 months. I also want to acknowledge the efforts of past and current legislation creating an equitable education system. These conversations are never easy, and so the willingness to tackle such difficult issues is much appreciated. In creating the current system, I recognize that it was progressive for its time, but change is inevitable. Fortunately for us, we have people who do research like Tammy Colby to ensure that we become more effective and efficient for this ever-changing world. And reflecting, I am thankful for the innovative thought process of the legislators in 1997, but no doubt all of us know that the current pupil weights are not correct. I joined the Winooski School Board in 2017 because I thought my academic background, which includes master's degrees in electrical engineering and applied statistics, and a PhD in higher education, and my professional background, which includes 16 years working in institutional research and assessment, would be an asset. My professional peers have also recognized my expertise as I was recently elected to be president-elect of the Northeast Association for Institutional Research, which includes higher education institutions from Maine to Ohio to Maryland. In short, my expertise is in education and analyzing data. I also ran for the Winooski School Board because as an Asian American, I knew it would be important for the students of color in my community to see people of color in leadership positions. At times, I have failed them, especially during the budget season, when I was trying to balance their needs with what our taxpayers could afford. I thought when I joined the school board, I would be fighting to fund the arts program in a fiscally responsible way that would prevent gentrification. Hence, we would be educating the students that were currently living in our school district and not pricing them out of our city. Little did I know, I would be making decisions between year-round busing, school supplies, or building and updating a facility so that students did not have to learn in classrooms that sometimes reach 90 degrees. These are factors that many would consider our basic needs for a student, After reading Pupil Weighting Factors report, I learned the failure was not on me, but the inadequate weights of our current system. I have no doubt that we all agree that the current weights for students living in poverty, English language learners, and secondary students were insufficient, and that additional weights should be addressed to address further inequities related to middle school students, school districts in sparsely populated regions of the state, and geographically necessary small schools. Given the numerous public testimonies from our children, from parents, students, teachers, principals, and superintendents, we can see the harm it has done to our children. It is also not by accident that the best schools, according to the US News and World Report rankings, are in well-funded districts. Thus, I appreciate that the task force constantly asks, if we were to rebuild our school finance system from the bottom up to ensure educational equity, how would you do it? In answering this question, I think we can turn to higher education for guidance. In the past, higher education quality was primarily judged by inputs such as expenditures per student, number of library books, number of applications, etc. It is only in the last 20 years we are not only judged by the inputs, but also by its outputs, learning outcomes, retention rates, graduation rates. The elegance of the PFW study is that it's created weights with outcomes in mind. In simple terms, the research users used 10 years of data to examine what the cost would be for equitable student achievement. In this study, student achievement is defined as the average mean score across grades and subject. I appreciate the task force's concern that outcomes were the standardized testing. Yes, I agree that they are not the most perfect measure, but there's no such thing as a perfect metric. Yes, yet aren't these the same metrics that the public is evaluating us on with regards to the quality of our school district? Thus, the measures used by the research was as good as a metric as you were going to get. And I appreciate that the researchers did not let perfection get in the way of progress. With that said, I think I've told members of the task force that if you're not happy with those metrics, then please use other items from the Vermont Youth Risk Behavior Survey, such as metrics like feeling sad or hopeless almost every day for at least 2-week period past 12 months. Have at least one teacher or other adult in their school that they can talk to and want to feel valued in their community. These are all data collected on a regular cycle, which would not place any additional burdens on our schools. The question then becomes, why ask the public if you aren't going to listen? I appreciate the task force effort to providing an alternative solution to an equitable weighting system. And at first glance, the cost equity forming approach appears to be reasonable. However, on a deeper eye, there are many flaws with the cost equity form. There's a reason why it took the PFW, the public weighting factors researchers, over a year to complete the report, which included a policy scan, literature reviews, and peer state profiles, and interviews to obtain stakeholder perception experiences with existing funding formula. Creating a solution for a brand new equitable system does not take merely 12 meetings, and the flaws are evident from a practical standpoint. For example, given that it takes so long for the state to provide information regarding yield, equalized pupil, and the common level appraisal, trying to add actual funding equivalent to the equation would make planning almost impossible for those school districts to rely on these funds. Did you study the merits on how long it would take to calculate actual funding? And truthfully, planning is a gift that some of the other districts have that we don't have. What gets counted in these costs, which would add more administrative burden to districts needing these funds? These costs will become harder to untangle, especially as education moves towards universal design in its design of the curriculum in the program, such as multi-tier system of support. I'll remind you that the core of this philosophy is if we account for all the characteristics of our student population, everybody benefits. And the notion of transparency is flawed, especially since there is a need to mask small counts. Given that 52 school districts meet the small school criteria, it is highly unlikely that the transparency desired will actually be accomplishable. And if you want an example, download the data from the Agency of Education dashboards and note how many hidden cells are masked due to small counts. Yet the real issues that the Coalition of Vermont Student Equity has with the cost equity formula is that it erodes local control. This is truly a slap to the face of all Vermonters essentially you have told us that the state government does not trust us to take care of our children. This is highly ironic since it was the state formula that prevented many of our school districts from educating our children in an equitable way. For the past 20 years, the state has trusted wealthy districts to make spending decisions that are best for their students and their communities. I want local control for my district as well, and it is a true Vermont value, because in our community, we can hold our school board officials much more accountable than legislators who do not live in our district. This is why we recommend that the general set of school level weights proposed in the Pupil Weighting Factor Reports authors October 28, 2021 memo. But we only support these weights when they include the ELL weight. As a person of color, I understand your concern with low incident districts not being able to or willing to provide resources for ELL students. I travel state often to attend many of the county fairs in the summer, and I cringe and worry about my safety when I see people wearing shirts with the Confederate flag. Even in a city that is as diverse as Winooski, I've been made to feel like an outsider. The number of times for example, the number of times I've been asked if I live in Winooski, if I'm a Winooski resident, even though I've introduced myself as a Winooski school board member. Therefore, we do recommend a hybrid approach to ensure school districts with a small number of EL students that are appropriately funded, correct the weights, and then the other additional aid to districts that educate, and then offer additional aid to districts that educate a small number of EL students. And I want to emphasize the note of the authors here, of the PW report authors on October 8th. A categorical funding program for EL students could be a viable policy alternative. Emphasized by the authors, if the funding available through this program is equivalent to the cost offset that would be generated by the weights identified in Model 4. Unfortunately, the task force has not identified a methodology that provides equivalent cost offsets that would be generated by the weight. The proposed ELL categorical A methodology in the task force is based on past ELL budgets. This was only perpetuate inequalities for ELL students because the design of the formula is based on an inequitable funding formula. For example, during our budget meeting this week, I learned it would cost about $130,000 to translate all of our handbooks and policies to ensure accessibility for the parents of all of our EL students. I don't see how Category A process will allow a school district to do this. But increasing our taxing capability does give us a chance to do this. Those why are districts that are welcoming to immigrants, refugees, and new Americans being punished? Please do not delay the process of implementing the weights when the work has already been completed. Not adequately funding our ELL students is not only discriminatory, but also makes our goals of creating an inclusive and welcoming environment even more difficult. The coalition supports the move to using free and reduced lunch as a measure for poverty, but only if the universal form is put in place. To change this measure without using a universal form will result in a substantially undocumented poverty count, as many free and reduced lunch forms go unreturned because of various reasons, including COVID-19 and now universal free lunch. Rural districts and small schools are also suffering greatly under the current inequitable formula. The conditions of these small rural schools and the harm they have experienced have been lost in this process. These are schools that have very specific needs to funding needs that have pushed their tax base to their breaking points. These are districts that tend to have a higher percentage of students living in poverty and students with disabilities. If you want and tour some of these schools, you'll be shocked. Buildings sit in despair, classrooms are tiny, and spaces beyond limited. Supplies are scarce. Teachers' salaries are substantially lower, and therefore it's nearly impossible to attract and retain new staff. Why would a teacher teach at Hazen Union when the average salary is $56,000 when they can teach at South Burlington where the average teaching salary is $80,294? Another alarm bell that we are ringing is the impending implementation of Act 173. Act 173 cannot be implemented except in conjunction with the corrected weights. The needs of the districts that have high poverty, small schools, extreme sparsity, and those that educate high number of ELL students will face catastrophic budgeting issues should a block grant based on census be implemented without implementing the correct weights. In reading the report, I started asking myself, what happened to a government that is of the people, for the people, by the people? In reading the report, where is the data of public opinion and endorsements from the Vermont School Board Association? Where is the analysis of the comments to address the concerns of the public, superintendents, principals, and the coalition of Vermont Student Equity? I appreciate you allowed us to speak, but was the task force listening? If you were, then where are the critical questions you needed to ask in your report? For example, what is the true philosophy behind the cost equity formula? Are we trying to be equitable from a cost perspective? Doesn't that mean that those who can afford to pay should, because in the long term, when we invest in our children, Vermont is better for it? Yet that doesn't seem to be the case with your cost equity proposal and goes against the findings that it costs more money to educate certain types of students. If you're worried about the weights hurting the overweighted districts, why not offer them categorical aid? Why is it that the districts with limited resources cannot be trusted to use their taxing capacity to properly provide the equitable education their children deserve? This sounds like a double standard to me. If you're worried about accountability, why not build accountability as Senator Brock has suggested? Higher education has been doing this for over 20 years. Yet it may seem odd to talk about learning outcomes audit, but a simple conversation with educational experts would have directed you to the field of learning outcomes assessment. By the way, this is part of my job duty to ensure the University of Vermont stays accredited by the New England Commission of Higher Education. I am more than happy to help that effort, but before you talk about accountability, make sure you have the capabilities to provide, to properly achieve, make sure we have the capabilities to properly achieve the desirable outcomes. The weighting formula proposal gives ability to resource and ability to plan. And finally, why did the task force only examine the short-term impacts, not think about the potential long-term impacts of implementing the pupil weighting factors? For example, we know that if we do a good job of educating our students, they are more likely to stay in our community when they become adults. The beauty of the Coalition for Vermont Student Equity is that we stand united because we care for all of our children. Even though there are many other things I would rather be doing with my time than studying and analyzing the educational funding formulas, one of the plus sides has been working with Vermonters from all over the state fighting for educational equity, and this includes you all. We trusted in each other's perspective, expertise, and lived experiences. I've also been able to hear the majority of the testimonies from the public, begging the legislators to give them the ability to properly educate the children in our communities. Be brave, be bold, be courageous, and provide the recommendations to implement the pupil weighting factors and remove the cost equity formula proposal. I know Vermonters will have your back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yin. We're exactly on time too. Well done. Are there any clarifying questions or anything? Senator Perchlik.
I didn't see your written comments on the, you are going to submit them? Okay, that'd be good.
Sorry, I was up until
Sure, no, I just
writing this.
Just wanted
I know that.
to now.
So I know the feeling that you all have because it brought back days to my writing a dissertation.
You're up there now.
Okay,
Just refresh your screen.
okay.
Anything else? Well, thank you so much, Mr. Yin. We really appreciate how involved you have been in this conversation from the very beginning and even previous to the report. And we really appreciate your expertise and your perspective. And thank you so much for just always engaging with us, and appreciate you coming today in person to talk with us. So yeah, thank you very much.
And know that we'll be involved, always here.
Yes. All right. So we're going to move back on screen, and we have Karen Horn from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Good morning, Ms. Horn.
Good morning. Thank you so much for allowing me to testify. You all have done a huge amount of work, clearly, over the last several months. I did want to take a moment to describe why the Vermont League of Cities and Towns is so interested in this issue. The Education Fund is 41% of the FY22 state funds, and 2/3 of the Education Fund is comprised of property taxes. The Education Fund has to be paid first by towns as they raise property taxes. And Vermont's spending per pupil is one of the highest among the states, which factors into our difficulty sometimes with affordability of living in the state of Vermont. I did want to mention that the property tax is the sole source of tax revenue for all but 24 cities and towns that have local option taxes. And in as much as the education property tax is the bulk of property taxes in most municipalities, not so much in the cities, but in most municipalities, there's a capacity limit for the municipal side of the ledger in meeting the needs that they have to meet with property taxes that are available. Our board of directors recently reaffirmed the position of the membership, and I'll just read it to you if I may. Legislation reforming Vermont's income, sales, cannabis, and property taxes to ensure sustainability economic recovery, a stabilized cost of living, and equity, particularly as those attributes relate to property tax contribution to the education fund, is one of our main priorities for this session, and actually for every session since the Vermont League of Cities and Towns was created in 1967. So, and when I send you my comments, which I hope to do this afternoon, I attach a list of the initiatives that have been developed by the League of Cities and Towns since 1967, just so that we have a good sense of that. So really, the local government issue interest on the municipal side is the capacity limit of the property tax constraining municipal ability to address its needs, the equity of education across the state, and affordability generally of Vermonters who want to stay or move to the state and live here and work here. We endorse the recommendations of the Tax Structure Commission and of the Pupil Weighting Factors report. And the Tax Structure Commission recommendation to move to an income tax base for all homestead owners, as well as setting up a tax advisory commission to review taxes on a regular basis, are two of the main recommendations that we support on the revenue side of the whole education fund discussion. We support the implementation of the Pupil Weighting Factors report on the expenditure side of the equation. And I want to point out that we are an association of all the cities and towns in the state of Vermont, and the board is representative of municipalities across the state, large and small, rich and poor. And the support for that position has been consistent across our board and our membership. The draft report does raise a number of issues for us with respect to the proposed cost equity model. And really, Professor Colby's slide number 6 describes those concerns in much better fashion than I had meant to do, far more articulate. We do want to point out that the draft report raises the specter of voters who, when faced with a changed tax capacity in a school district due to employing pupil weights with the tax equalization school funding formula, might choose to reduce education taxes or spend dollars on a number of different expenses rather than investing in education needs. It may be that the evaluation of that in evaluating the universe of needs confronting voters, they choose to shift their spending emphasis. That is, in fact, the case today, if you agree that voters actually have the final say over what a school budget funds and how much. That is not entirely the case, of course, because the statutes mandate budgetary support for a whole wide range of pre-K-12 education attributes, which you can find throughout Title 16. Conversely, voters can decide to spend more on education if they gain tax capacity or continue current spending levels, even if they lose tax capacity, leading, as the report indicated, to a bigger pie, that is increasing education spending overall. And that's the issue of cost containment in Professor Colby's slides. A bigger pie that would contribute to funding through that would contribute to funding through the education funding formula seems unnecessary, as Vermont's spending per pupil is consistently one of the highest among the states. In either instance, the legislature can and frequently does impose requirements and areas of education that districts have to spend money on. And they could do that in this instance as well. So we think that the issue of assuring that funds are spent in the appropriate way, that they're addressing the equity issues that are raised by the pupil factor weighting report, and that they're addressing cost containment can all be put into the statutes in Title 16 or Title 32. It does seem that the proposed cost equity approach contemplates the expansion of categorical aid categories for poverty, rurality, middle and high school, as well as English language learners. The difficulty with this approach, which you've already heard about, is that each year a new calculation would need to be made. And each year that calculation will be ripe for debate, as not only cost factors change and the question of how much is left for base funding is addressed, but also as statutory changes are made to programs, as we know they will be, and the legislative appetite for keeping payments accurate over time is likely to falter, especially in lean times. And we can see this not only in education funding, but in a whole range of issues that the legislature has to deal with on a year-to-year basis. And as priorities change, as attention is diverted, as new people come into the legislature, you are going to have a situation where the ability to automatically, if you will, provide the appropriate amounts of funding is going to get harder and harder, which is sort of why we're in the place that we're in today. So we strongly support you actually implementing the pupil weighting factors report in the way that was proposed, and don't make yourselves susceptible to these annual discussions about, and fights really, about who gets how much money, where and when. Thank you. I think I didn't take 15 minutes, but
you did great. You are under your time. Thank you so much, Karen. Does anyone have any questions? Senator Hooker.
Thank you. Just a quick question, Karen. When you say that you support the weights, are you talking about the original weights, or are you talking about the weights from Professor Colby's memo in October, where they were adjusted because of policy decisions that the task force has made?
We think that those weights in the October memo will work for towns, for districts, excuse me. What we're concerned about really is the prospect of every year having to discuss what's an appropriate payment for all of these different categories of funding. And the likelihood that that the objectives won't be respected or actually even remembered over time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions or clarifications? And you're going to submit written comments later today?
Yeah, I have them half written, but I need to clean them up.
No worries. Thank you so much for coming to join us today and providing the perspective of our City of Leaks and Town, ELCT, cities and towns. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then next, I see you popped up on the screen, Mr. Moore from the Independent Schools Association. Thank you so much, Mr. Moore, for being here with us. You probably have heard that I'm trying to keep everyone on a schedule, so we'll have 15 minutes, and we appreciate you joining us today. And why don't you just introduce yourself and take it away?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm sure that I will not need 15 minutes. Good morning to everybody on the task force. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Mill Moore, Executive Director of the Vermont Independent Schools Association. My focus today is on the tuition programs paragraphs that appear within Section 14 of your draft report. My association is pleased that the draft report acknowledges deficiencies in the way rates are set for public support of tuition payments going to approved independent schools. This has been a very long-standing concern in the independent schools community. We're very pleased to see it acknowledged and encouragement for addressing this. We acknowledge also the draft report's recommendation that the Agency of Education and the State Board of Education address the need to improve and standardize the public school tuition setting formula. However, ultimately, any changes must be made by the General Assembly, then followed by State Board of Education rulemaking that it will be done with input from the stakeholders and from the Agency of Education. So whether the initiative for this should originate within the executive branch or within the General Assembly is something that I suggest be given some further consideration. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Are you proposing another task force?
Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. Because right now I feel like nobody wants another task force. So I just want to clarify that.
No, there's no need for that.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Moore? Okay, well, thank you so much. You've given time to others. And I see Jeff Francis has popped up on the screen. Good morning, Mr. Francis, if you want to just introduce yourself and take it away.
Good morning. I am Jeffrey Francis, the Executive Director of the Vermont School Superintendents Association. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'd like to start my testimony by thanking you, all members of the task force, for the energy and effort that you have invested in this process to date, for developing the draft report, and for your past, current, and future efforts to follow through in a manner that will improve equity and opportunity within the education funding and delivery system in Vermont. Appreciation is also extended to all those who have contributed to the work, including your staff and the witnesses who have shared their insights, comments, and expertise. This work is of tremendous importance and consequence, especially in light of the considerations and potential decisions that you have included within the report and the context, analysis, and future decisions that will inform those deliberations and decisions. When I received the draft report on Wednesday this week, I sent it on to all members of the Vermont Superintendents Association. As you well know, because of the pandemic, local school officials have been occupied by the challenges of operating school systems amidst the most disruptive conditions ever collectively experienced by the system overall. And those officials have had little time to focus on the work of the task force to this point. This is true for all personnel working in public education, including superintendents, who are the chief executive officers for the systems that they serve and who hold significant and comprehensive responsibility for all school operations. For this reason, most superintendents have not had the time or ability to follow the work of the task force in detail, but like me, they are keenly aware of the importance of the work and are heavily invested in supporting the best outcomes. After all, what is being contemplated are significant modifications to a funding system which was successfully established in order to bring more equity and opportunities to students and treat taxpayers and communities more fairly. Overall, that system has worked well, and there is broad recognition and acceptance of the fact that the time has come to improve equity within the system through, in the most basic terms, improved access to more equitable resources for students with recognized specific needs. In the absence of thorough feedback from the superintendents on the contents of the draft report, which was impossible given the short time between the release of the report and your meeting today, I was disinclined to provide preliminary specific comments on their collective behalf. The nature of the decisions under consideration and the inevitable impact on individual school districts and the students they serve does not lend itself to input arrived at hastily on behalf of the association. In order to facilitate work by superintendents collectively in response to the report, I am arranging work sessions scheduled over the next several weeks where superintendents will be invited to come together to delve into the report and work collaboratively in an effort to better understand and consider the information, recommendations, and decision points that it sets out. It is unknown to me at this point whether the association will be able to achieve consensus with respect to recommendations around those decision points, but that will be our goal. To support this effort, I am hoping that the task force will inform me regarding who I should be in touch with questions and requests for additional information as we conduct our work. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning, and thank you again for your efforts to date.
Thank you, Jeff. Are there any questions for Mr. Francis for clarification? Representative Kornheiser.
I really appreciate that you are able and interested in taking the time to dive deep onto this work with the superintendents, given all of the other work in front of them right now, and all of the really tough conversations. And I also know that probably many of them could very much use a break this upcoming couple weeks in December. And so I would just like to offer up myself, and I'm sure Chair Hardy, to provide any clarification or participate in any of those conversations in the upcoming weeks. And I'm sure anyone else on the task force is also available to answer questions either in their own district or otherwise. I appreciate that you're able to take the time for those workshops and amidst all the other things going on, and thank you.
I appreciate that, and would just comment that yeah, I have some regret that I wasn't able to come in this morning with very specific comments and recommendations regarding the report. But when one considers the sheer magnitude of both the topics that you include in the report and sort of the variable effect that those considerations could have on a district by district basis and a student by student basis, the importance of making sure that all folks, but superintendents in particular, understand this with as much detail as possible is of utmost concern to me. And despite the fact that I've got a fair amount of experience navigating the public policy arena, these circumstances were really just of such tremendous importance. That stated, we do have equity as a principle. We want to make sure that the mechanics of the system moving forward will work well. We want to especially make sure that the equity that is sought is going to be delivered. And because you've thoughtfully included an array of not only sort of main decision points like cost equity versus weights, the treatment of English language learner students, which I know, as you know, has arisen to the top of concerns on the part of some school districts. I, in my review of the draft, said VSA will engage very seriously moving forward, but in order to do that, I need a basis for our positions that I can only obtain in direct conversations with as many superintendents as I can involve. So I appreciate those comments, Representative Kornheiser. I know that you understand as a complete task force the challenges facing public education right now. And I give you our commitment that we're going to do our best to make very, very thoughtful contributions to this process as it continues. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And we have heard from a number of superintendents throughout our process, and we're really appreciative of those who have been able to engage. And we know how much pressure you're under. And I'm sure you appreciate how much pressure we were under to get out a report in the time period that we were under. So but there's plenty of time still to engage during the session and for years to come, undoubtedly. So thank you for making sure that superintendents are at the table for these conversations, because it's clear that they are crucial.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions for Jeff? Great, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. We, let me see.
Is Jeff Fennon there, sir?
Is Jeff Bannon here?
Just sent me his comments.
It's comments from the website.
Jeff Bannon, are you there? I do not see your name on the screen.
I don't think I've seen him the whole time.
Why don't we take a break?
Well, I just want to actually,
Is he?
before Professor Colby leaves at 10:30, does anybody have any questions for her? Tammy, are you still there? Okay, great. Because I know if as you've heard other things before we lose her, does anyone have any further questions? Cheryl, did you? I'm sorry, Senator Hooker. Okay. Senator Perchlik.
I guess like one question, Dr. Colby, is in the other states that do these kind of categorical aid, do they run into the concerns that have been brought up about the legislature, monkeying with them every year? Or have other states found a way to make those formulaic so that they're not part of a annual appropriation debate?
Thank you. That's a great question. To my knowledge, no state is running this approach right now. The most recent and geographically proximate state that did this was New York State, and in the 90s. And I will tell you that it was pretty unsuccessful for all of the reasons I suggested and a few others, but a lot of monkeying around that went on, and ultimately districts sued the state and the state lost. And that was the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, and the state was forced to come up with a very different system. What the state found was it was very difficult to calibrate, very difficult to maintain. And over time, what happened is they started with the core group of these, and then over time, more got added on, little ones, and it just became this proliferation of small categorical grant programs. And it was very, very difficult to add across all those programs to know sort of, are we really calibrating for equity? And then, of course, in the 90s, there was a lot of contentious budget negotiations in the state, and this was one of the things that oftentimes got cut. So I'm sorry to say that at least in sort of our neighboring state, that it didn't meet with a lot of success. But I can, if you'd like, I can go and back through the annals and see if I can find other examples that I can offer you. I just know of New York State as a more recent and geographically proximate example. And I also would point again to the small school grant program, right? Like, that's been hard in the legislative process at times. And, I think it could be the case that sort of those same kinds of things could spill over into these grants. Could you think about ways to put some guardrails around that in statute? I suppose you could. I don't know of any specific strategies that have been used other places. And again, I'm happy to try to look back and make some phone calls around that, if that would be helpful. I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, no, that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, I'm not trying to sort of bias the conversation. I'm just, again, trying to say, like, these are trade-offs that we have to think about.
I think Representative Beck has a question.
Yep.
Professor Colby, does New York have a self-balancing education fund?
They do not.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for Professor?
Representative Beck, we're essentially the only state in the country that has a self-balancing
Right.
education fund, right? And
That's what I thought, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
They're running something that looks a little bit more like a foundation formula, but it's more complex than that. If you'd like more information on it, I can get more information for you. Would that be helpful?
Sure. I was interested in learning about other states.
And I just want to remind committee members that we did take testimony from the Education Commission of the state specific to ELL grants, but there's a lot of information on the updated 50 state comparison about what other states do in various realms of school funding. And it's a really valuable resource. Professor Colby used the previous study in her study, and then they updated it and it came out in October. So that's a good place to look for sort of comparisons as well.
ECS does a good job. And also there was a study done for Nevada by a group of school funding consultants that includes, I would say, a more detailed and nuanced sort of overview of the state. It's a couple years old, but I don't think there have been major changes in other states. And so I'm also happy to share that if that's helpful to you.
Sure, if you'd like to send that along, that would be great. Senator Brock.
Professor Colby, were you here for Dr. Yin's presentation?
For some of it, I've had a little bit of computer challenges this morning, so I heard some of it, but not all of it.
Well, he raised some issues as to whether the categorical funding proposal, as it would affect a district like Winooski's, would actually perpetuate inequities. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Having not heard exactly how he framed that, I can't be specific, but what I mean, I did raise in my comments that there are opportunities, you know, there could be the chance that a categorical funding system could perpetuate existing and create new inequities because it's at the middle, right? And so if in fact a district like Winooski would require more dollars on average than what the grant, right, is calibrated at, then that district would be systematically disadvantaged.
And that's exactly what he indicated in his testimony, particularly talking about the need to translate handbooks and policy into accessible languages for the population, and they might be disadvantaged by the type of formula that is being proposed here.
I think that is a risk with option 2. I think the other thing, and again, I didn't hear Dr. Yin's testimony, the other sort of consideration here is that when we have a grant at the middle, it sort of assumes average levels of disadvantage, right? And so what it may be, my dog has strong opinions on this. It may be that in places like Winooski that serve concentrations of students who are economically disadvantaged, who are language minorities, that the level of disadvantage there may be more intense and require greater than average resources, right? And so this is one of the so the calibration to Representative James's comment before, like, so we can calibrate these things, but they're always going to be calibrated at the middle, right? And so what a categorical grant scheme doesn't do is it doesn't deal with the tails very well. But when you think about it, what's the whole point of what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to make sure that the tails of the distribution, those districts at the bottom end who have higher costs, higher need, are brought to the middle. And we're also we want a system that makes sure that districts with less need, lower costs, don't spend off the top and continue widening the gap, right? And when we have a policy that really is targeted at the middle, there's a risk, right? That the policy doesn't do a good job at the tails. And then what happens is those gaps can widen. So again, these are trade-offs. If you compare that to the equalized pupil calculation, which has its own set of trade-offs, you know, what the equalized pupil calculation does is it is adjusting what school districts think are appropriate levels of investment to get students to common outcomes. And so a place like Winooski may recognize that they need even higher levels of spending that go over and above that average grant amount, right? Because they have greater needs. And then the weights the weights are used to recalibrate those costs, but it's based on those local decisions. And so that's one of these inherent tensions between the two, right? Which is it's at the middle versus this court calibrates the spending that local decision makers what local budgets are passed. Is that helpful?
It is, but part of my difficulty in this entire conversation has been to translate the theoretical concepts of weighting versus categorical grants with the real on-the-ground issue of how do you get enough money to provide ELL instruction to the kid in the town in the Northeast Kingdom that has one ELL student to a district in Burlington that may have scores of them.
And I think that is that's a challenging issue in Vermont and other rural states where we have, unlike a state like California, where we have sort of more even distribution of ELL students across districts, right? Or at least it's not as compartmentalized geographically, right? So in Vermont, we are very, right? It's not geographically dispersed. And so we have economies of scale and scope issues, right? In certain districts. And then we have concentration effects over here. And so in our memo, we do talk about the fact that, that may be cause to think about a well-designed categorical grant program for ELL students in the state. But in designing that, I think you're hitting on some of the key considerations, which is, sort of what do we do about the one student here versus the concentrations over here? And the burden would be on policymakers to think carefully about sort of all those contingencies to make sure a categorical grant program works. The other thing that has not come up in this discussion, and I hesitate to even bring it up, but we are trying to equalize opportunity across a very large number of school districts in the state, right? This is a large number of schools, and some of the districts are quite small. And, there is a juxtaposition between this conversation and Act 46. And so when we're trying to equalize across lots of small jurisdictions, these kinds of questions become even more difficult to answer because just like you said, what happens when I have one student in one district, one small district here, right? And I have another one over here in the neighboring district, but they're not in the same district. And so it makes me wonder whether or not there are opportunities in this conversation to think in terms of regionalization of services and how we might fund those, as well as sort of how much more difficult this conversation is around equalizing costs and spending, how much more difficult that conversation is when we have a very large number of school districts in the state versus what that would look like if we had a smaller number. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Colby. I know you have to leave because it's almost 10:30, so we don't want to keep you, and we do have our next witness here. So thank you again for all of your time and expertise, and I'm sure we'll see you soon. Or
let me know. I'm happy to try to respond to questions in writing as well, since I have to go. So have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Jeff Fannin. Thank you so much for joining us in our newly rearranged room.
Well, I feel like I should stand up and say, may it please the court.
No. We are, I don't know if you heard my spiel because you've been in transit.
I did not.
We are trying to keep witnesses to 15 minutes because we have a number of them. People have been doing a great job, so we're ahead of schedule, but I will be cutting you off if I need to with apologies. I'm sure you'll be fine. So
I don't have, my comments are written. I submitted them to Sorsha. I need to proof them again because I saw a mistake, but
we know that feeling.
Yeah, it's never ending, the editing process.
Yeah.
So good morning, Jeff Fannin, Executive Director of Vermont NEA. I'd like to start by saying thank you for giving Vermont NEA the opportunity to give you some preliminary thoughts on your draft report of the task force on people waiting. It is obvious this is complicated and that you have weighed a lot of possible factors and solutions, and no pun intended there. And truthfully, this issue has tremendous consequences for districts, staff, students, communities. So thank you for your very hard work with this very complicated subject. Truly, it's not been easy. I know we've watched, and it's done a lot of work here. It's impressive, and that's because it's not just a waiting discussion. It involves tax policy, and it involves education quality standards. So you're covering a lot of waterfront here. So thank you. It's not easy. We appreciate that. And I think, as you've heard, the issue of waiting is complex, and the history of how we got to the current waits is unclear to us. Just frankly, it seems obvious here now. And I've been doing this kind of work for 20 years, and nobody asked this question 15 years ago. So good for you for asking it and trying to answer it. We believe how we weight, though, for students, especially those from poverty and with a disability, is very important, and making adjustments to the current weighting is needed. We know and have spoken previously about the complex and increasing social and emotional needs of our students and the effect that has on their ability to access their learning. How we weight for students with some of those complex needs affects how local districts choose to support some of those students. What the exact or appropriate weighting should be is perhaps beyond our expertise at Vermont NEA, I'll be honest with you. And appreciate the draft nature of the report. Poverty is key, though, and we think that you truly must account for those children growing up in poverty. We've been saying that for many, many years. I know you've tried, and it's in the report, so thank you. But that's how we educate, kids from impoverished backgrounds. That is what makes our public school system so vibrant, frankly, in a lot of ways. The Universal Income Declaration form in your report is advisable, I think. I'm just wondering about compliance. How do you get people to do that? So I'm just stating some practical realities, but I think it's advisable to go there. Perhaps it's better than the free and reduced lunch effort. Although I know you talked about transitioning there. We all need to get this right, or at least very least give ourselves room to make some changes and then study the changes to ensure that we don't overcorrect. It's a concern we have, and make matters worse, however well-intentioned they may be. As such, I agree with the draft report's suggestion to establish an education tax advisory committee to advise the legislature going forward. Likewise, the evaluation mechanism also is advisable too. So good for you for putting in some ways to examine this going forward. Regarding the specific recommendations on page 4 and 5, ELL, categorical aid, students in poverty, small schools, and merger grants and transition supports, these all seem ripe for a further discussion and merit serious consideration. The small school grant issue, however, does need to extend state support to our rural schools. Professor Colby just talked about that, I think. It doesn't appear to be on the case on page 4. I'm trying to figure out this report a little bit. I struggled with it, so understanding it, so forgive me. Vermont NEA testified in the House Education Committee last February. The pupil weighting study provided significant, important analysis, and we fundamentally agreed that if we continue to use weights as the metric to high quality, equitable education for all students, they must be adjusted. The cost equity formula approach is interesting. I'll just say that. And is self-described as simpler, which is good, which makes it seem all the more attractive, right? Simple is good sometimes, but we don't fully understand it. We want to understand it to get there, and we reserve further comment on it. But it's an intriguing start. I'll say that. The mention of possibly accounting for students in need of mental health services and suffering from there's another typo in trauma. The recommendation on the top of page 6 is a very worthy recommendation. Before the pandemic, this was an issue, and it has gotten only worse during the pandemic. Indeed, Vermont NEA held a summit on safe, compassionate learning environments in May of 2019. And it was attended by more than 200 Vermont educators and trauma experts up in Burlington. Students in need of such services must receive them, and schools are the sanctuaries where these services are delivered to students. They must be acknowledged and resources made available to make that happen. So we appreciate you looking at that or acknowledging that. It's a good note. The ELL section is critical, but frankly, the section is not yet formed enough on which to comment. Obviously, the changes discussed are significant, and without greater details opining as to one suggestion versus another is premature right now for us. Adequate funding for these ELL students, though, again, is necessary, and Vermont NEA supports that effort. And finally, as I said in August when I testified to you, Vermont NEA supports the Tax Structure Commission's suggestion to abolish the residential property tax in favor of the income tax. We believe that simplicity, like here again, simplicity, and equity and fairness are critical in moving forward with the Commission's recommendation would be good for our schools, communities, and taxpayers. Income taxes, like property taxes, are variable at the margins, but income taxes are stable, and they're stable enough for the state general fund. We think that's good enough. We think it's also the best way to measure, as the tax commission said, the best way to measure tax burden on a given taxpayer, and it is the most progressive way to tax residents for education at this time. For this reason, the commission recommended replacing the hybrid property income tax, homestead tax base with a single tax base, and to maintain equity, that single tax base should be income. Vermont supports the commission's recommendation and appreciates that the task force here took testimony in this and included it as one of your additional recommendations for consideration in the report. Thank you. I'll conclude by saying we know this is not easy. It's not simple, and many will criticize you in your work, but success may take several years and several iterations. And you've accounted for that. So thank you. And we want to walk that path with you and support what you've accomplished so far. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Jeff, Representative Kornheiser.
Thanks, Jeff. I just have a quick clarification. When you were talking about the small schools, did you think in reading the draft report that we weren't recommending resources for small schools?
I was trying to, again, I'm fundamentally trying to understand.
Yeah.
So
And we didn't give you very much time. So
no, that's fine. Yeah, and that's quick. It's a lot there, and a lot, is still draft and awaiting some other stuff. I thought that you, I think it's on page 23.
To get rid of the small school grants.
Yeah, somehow backfill it. We want to make sure that we are a rural state.
Yeah.
That we acknowledge that and somehow make sure that they are not penalized, if you will, for being rural in nature. So we are as a state.
yeah, we are recommending small school weights and sparsity weights or cost equity payments, whichever model. And if that was, I'm asking because if that wasn't clear in the report, I want to make sure it is clear in the report. And so it's helpful to me that that wasn't clear to you. It's helpful to know that wasn't clear. So
I could probably read it again and come up with some clarity.
I want, in some ideal universe, people could read this once and have clarity. And so, thank you.
Yes, I could read it again and again and get there. But so if you've done that, great. I think that's perfect.
And I'm thanking you for your misunderstanding because it meant that we have some clarifying to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm glad my misunderstanding is helpful.
It is.
Rarity.
It's a funny way to get to it.
Are there other questions or comments for Jeff? Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Fannin, for joining us in person. We appreciate your time and all of the engagement that the NEA has put into this process.
Thank you for doing this work. This is not easy. We've said it over and over again. It's good luck, and we want to work with you to get there. I hope everybody has a good break.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to, speaking of breaks, we're going to take a short break because the Secretary of Education, Ms. Jan French, can't join us until 11, unless, is Honor Horton available?
Can't join until 11.
Okay, so we can take a break until a little bit before 11, just to make sure we're all here at 11. And come back and get more testimony, unless there's anything people want to comment on or ask.
Can we take a break and then?
Okay, yes, go ahead, take a break, come back at 5.